Meanwhile, it's time again to check in with political science professor at Western Michigan University, Peter Wielhouwer. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Richard.
When we spoke last, there was more than one candidate on the Republican side for president. That has changed.
It has. They've all fallen away except for Donald Trump, and so it looks like he's positioned to be the guy.
Yeah. Was that a shocker, you think, that Ted Cruz was so quick to back out?
Well, I think that he had put in the final analysis, he had put a lot of his eggs in the basket of Indiana, and when he did so relatively poorly there, with Donald Trump winning a majority of the Republican vote, I think that he just said this is not really good for the party, and it's certainly not something that I can win, and so he just called it.
Mm-hmm. And Kasich shortly after that, kind of thinking the same thing, we presume?
I think so. You know, the whole Stop Trump coalition that they tried to reform in the last month or so just really didn't work out the way that they expected. They got some bad PR. They had coordination problems because really the campaigns are not designed to work that way. And so I think it made it really difficult for them to pull off the challenge to Trump that they were trying to mount.
Mm-hmm. Nico had a story earlier this morning about a professor at a university in, I think it was Alabama, who's going to this summer have a full 3-credit course on the Trump campaign exclusively and studying the man and the candidate. This has been something of a study, hasn't it?
It really has, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of books and articles he chooses for that, because most of what political scientists know about the way campaigns work, and political practitioners for that matter, Trump has really thrown the handbooks out the door. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what he comes up with. I myself am teaching a campaigns and elections class for undergraduates in the fall, so it'll be very interesting to see how things shake out there once we get to a clearly two-person candidate, or people are still talking about the possibility of a third-party candidate. Bill Kristol on Morning Joe this morning was continuing to talk about this possibility.
Who would that be?
Well, he mentioned Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse. I think the real problem there, of course, is name recognition.
Right.
Nobody outside the Beltway in Washington and Nebraska knows who the heck Ben Sasse is. So I think it'd be hard to mount a credible nationwide campaign for the guy.
Yeah. This all based on the notion, and we'll talk about this in just a second, that you have disenfranchised Republicans, and we presume we're going to have some disenfranchised Democrats, too. And so there may be a pretty ripe opportunity for a third-party candidate to show up. We'll discuss that when we come right back in just a minute. Professor Peter Wielhouwer from the Poli-Sci Department at Western is back with us today. So we've been talking about the notion of a third-party candidate. You know, it's clearer right now, at least in some of the analysis, that you may have, and we apparently do, a unit of the Republican voter electorate that would say, I'm not voting for Trump. So now what do? And they're not voting for Hillary either. We presume she'll be the nominee. And then you've got the other side where you've got some Sanders fans who don't want to vote for Hillary either. So is this maybe the best opportunity for an independent candidate to show up?
Well, I think that it would be really difficult for a third-party candidate to make much of an impact. Strategically, what would really need to happen is you have to have a candidate who could win a couple of states, win the Electoral College votes in a couple of states, and deny either of the other two candidates a majority of the Electoral College. I don't think that there's really any way that a third-party candidate could outright win the Electoral College. The system is just not set up to operate that way. Mm-hmm. But if you could get a candidate who somehow could win Ohio, for example, or could win Florida, one of those swing states that both parties need to win in order to win the presidency, that's really the only scenario in which a third-party candidate can make a difference in the election. And then, of course, it goes to the House of Representatives, and they are certainly not going to vote for anybody. If you got the Republicans controlling the House of Representatives and controlling the state delegations in the House, they are not going to vote for Hillary, and they're not going to vote for this third-party upstart, whoever he or she might be.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's just strategically, the way the system is set up with the Electoral College is just to have a third-party candidate try to actually win the election. It's just not possible.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have anybody who has the stature and the organization and the finances to make this possible.
So Donald Trump, among the first things he said after the other two went away is, we're going to unify the party. Is he the guy to do that?
Well, I think he can make deals, can't he? So he ought to be the guy
Well,
who can do this. But I think his main problem is that he doesn't have very many long-term relationships within the Republican Party. He's got some people in the House and the Senate and governors who are willing to work with him because he's the Republican nominee. But the fact of the matter is that I think that you've got people who have long-term connections within the party. They've got a long-term commitment to the health of the party, not just winning the presidency. And he has to really do a lot to work to develop those relationships. And that's just an awful lot of work, an awful lot of communication and politicking to do in a relatively short amount of time. I think it could be done, and I think that we'll have a good sign about this when we see what happens with the meeting between Donald Trump and Paul Ryan on Thursday.
Yeah,
that'll give us a good indicator.
What do you make of that? I'm not ready to back him, Paul Ryan says.
Well, I think there are a couple of things going on there. I think one is he's really not ready to back him because Trump is not a long-term Republican. He's not an ideological conservative. He could win the presidency. I mean, that's a real possibility, and so Paul Ryan probably would need to work with him if the Republicans hold the House next year. But I think that he really wants to hear more on a personal one-to-one level what Donald Trump is saying that he actually will try to accomplish from a policy standpoint. Paul Ryan is big on policy. He's not just about the politics. And I think that he truly is trying to figure out what the guy's about. And I think that he wants the presidential candidate to come to him. I mean, he's the most prominent Republican elected leader in the nation. He's the leader of the party in the House. Arguably, he says, I want this guy to come and have a conversation with me before I get behind him.
So this is an ego thing.
Well, I would push it more as a prestige thing. I mean, you've got the two top people who are going to be the representatives of the Republican Party at the national level, and you've got one who's earned his way and one who's kind of reality TV'd his way, and I think that there's an interesting relationship that's going to be developing there.
Mm-hmm. So back to the third-party candidates thing for a minute. Why doesn't Bernie just do that? I mean, he's going around saying, I'm the guy to beat Trump, not Hillary. So what if he became the third-party candidate?
So if Bernie Sanders became a third-party candidate, it seems to me that he would have a chance of perhaps denying Hillary Clinton wins in some of those swing states like Ohio or perhaps Florida. But I think for the most part, his interest primarily in that case, once we get past the Democratic convention, would be keeping Donald Trump from winning the presidency. And I think that Bernie Sanders, for all his vitriol against Hillary Clinton and against the establishment Democrats, I think that he certainly would much prefer to have a Democrat win rather than a Republican. And my guess is that he will get behind Hillary Clinton at or by the convention, and that most of his supporters, perhaps not all, but most of his supporters will get behind him. I think that he's smart enough strategically to know that he also could not win nationally, and that if he divided the Democratic vote, it would give the presidency to the Republicans, and I think that would be his least preferred outcome.
Professor Peter Wielhouwer is back with us. We're chatting with Professor Peter Wielhouwer, WMU Poli-Sci Department, as we continue to track the presidential race. So it's interesting. We have that contingent on both sides, at least we are led to believe we do, that are not immediately falling in line. But you're saying that at least it's entirely possible that on both sides, those who have been not ready to fall in line, Paul Ryan, Bernie Sanders, they will eventually. So does that mean, in your sense, then, so will the voters?
I think so. I think that when we look at the polling results at the national level and even at some of these state-level polls that have been released at a potential Clinton versus Trump matchup, we've got about 15 to 20% that are undecided, who say that they're undecided. So if we think that if the historic averages hold, 90% of the Republicans are just going to vote Republican. 90% of the Democrats are just going to vote Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
So what really matters is what happens to the people who are currently undecided or who are undecided by the time Labor Day rolls around. And if they split 50-50, I think that it works for Hillary Clinton's advantage. In some of these states, I think that Republicans ought to have pretty securely, such as North Carolina and Georgia. Hillary Clinton looks like she could win those states. And, of course, Barack Obama won North Carolina in 2008, so it's not outside the realm of possibilities. So I think that the Republicans then would be hoping that states such as Pennsylvania and Ohio, with a kind of a strong blue-collar but economically distressed economy, would tilt in Trump's favor. So I think most of the Republicans will end up voting with their party. That said, I think that the Never Trump movement that we see in social media and discussed elsewhere, I think that's a stronger, more committed group of people than the Sanders folks who say now that they would not support Hillary Clinton, but in the end probably would.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So in your classes, when you're talking about the Trump phenomenon, that is to say, whatever the climate is that gave him lift, what's being said? I mean, how do people and young people interpret what this means?
Well, I think that the students of mine that have supported Trump, or that at least find him intriguing, I think that they're expressing the same kind of things that we've talked about many times in the past, and that is just a general frustration with kind of politics as usual. But young people probably are not a great gauge of Trump support. I think the real support for Donald Trump is kind of their older brothers, maybe their fathers and mothers' generation, and slightly younger siblings. So probably those people who are in their 30s and 40s, for whom the economy has not recovered very well over the last few years. And these are people who might otherwise vote Democrat, but because they see in Donald Trump this visceral expression of frustration with the system and politics as usual, these are new people who are differently engaged than they otherwise were. And so I think that that's the kind of folks that Donald Trump is really tapping into, at least on the Republican side. Mm-hmm. And it may be that there are some Democrats, as we've talked about, in those swing states, those old industrial states, that may swing over to him too. Mm-hmm. I was speaking with some folks a couple weeks ago, and they said that their union friends are surprisingly supportive of Donald Trump here in Michigan. So that could be a really interesting turn of affairs if the union rank and file support Donald Trump, whereas the union leaders themselves fall in behind Hillary Clinton, as we would expect.
Why can't Hillary just command all that typical Democratic support? Why is there a little nugget out there that she isn't as popular as she could be?
Well, I think that's a long story, right? I mean, there's a long history of the Clinton family, and some of it's really positive, and a lot of people look back fondly to the economic growth of the 1990s, positive changes that took place, long-term strong relationships between the Clintons and the African American community. I think that those really, that core element of what's going on within the Democratic Party coalition itself, their now support for gay rights and other things like that really help them within the party. That said, there are some people who simply do not trust her. The exit polls that we were seeing earlier on in the process, with 40 to 45% of Democrats saying that they didn't think that Hillary Clinton was trustworthy. That's a significant barrier, I think, to people really getting excited about her. I think they'll kind of hold their nose and vote for her in the end, but it's difficult to build excitement when people don't think you're very trustworthy.
What is behind that?
Well, it's a combination of a long-term kind of political schmoozing that has to happen, the idea of being a Democrat but not being extremely liberal on a lot of things, voting for the war in Iraq, for example, voting for continuing funding for the armed conflicts, kind of being a latecomer to the marriage equality kind of movement. this sense that even she has admitted that she is not a hardline liberal. A large chunk of the Democratic voting base call themselves quite liberal, and she's not. I mean, her voting record in the Senate, she's not. She's right in the middle of the Democratic Party for the Senate. She was not extremely liberal. So I think that there's a sense there that, yes, she says she's a liberal Democrat, but she's a pragmatist. And if you're an ideologue and you value principle over politics and compromise, then you're going to be frustrated with somebody like that, who arguably would be a better president, but who is not going to toe the line in terms of your ideological preferences.
Got it. We're almost out of time, but I do want to ask this. The email thing. It's interesting because the loudest conservative voices, most of which you hear on WBCK after this show, and the loudest liberal voices, which tend to show themselves mostly in social media, I think, have very different viewpoints on this email thing. The conservatives say, "Oh, go get her," and then the liberals say, "This is nothing." What is it about this thing? Does it have any traction?
Well, I think it's actually going to turn out to be quite important if the Obama administration FBI indicts Hillary Clinton during the campaign.
Sure.
I think it's going to be hard for the liberals to continue to make the case that it's nothing. The fact that the FBI and the DOJ continue to pursue this investigation against Hillary Clinton is a real problem for her. If it ends up that they don't indict, I think it'll be a wash. It's certainly a red meat and rallying call for the Republicans, and I think a chunk of independents have grave concerns about her. But on the other hand, there was an interesting story yesterday on NPR about the presidential candidates having access to classified material during the campaigns so that they don't say things that they can't possibly keep later on. And there was real concern expressed about giving Donald Trump access to the nation's secrets before he becomes president. I mean, so Hillary Clinton, even though she's got problems in that area, at least she knows the rules of the road in terms of handling classified materials. People aren't nearly as confident about that with Donald Trump.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Peter. We appreciate the time as always.
My pleasure.
Peter Wielhouwer, Political Science Department, Western Michigan University.